Welcome to today's Southern Fire Exchange webinar. This is Jeannie Patton. I am the communications lead for the Nature Conservancy's Landfire program. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer and hand this over. She'll start with the overview of today's webinar and then get started. Jennifer earned her Ph.D. in ecology in 2010 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Since then, she's been working in the North Carolina Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at NC State University. Jennifer has used Landfire data for a number of projects, from assessing threats to vegetation and fire regimes in the Southeast, which she'll talk about today, to examining the potential impacts of bioenergy production scenarios to landscapes and wildlife across North Carolina. So Jen, thanks very much, and let's get started.
Okay, thanks, Jeannie. Like Jeannie said, I've used Landfire data for a number of projects, and I appreciate you all joining the webinar to learn about a couple that I'll talk about today. A couple examples. One is an example of assessing current vegetation modification in the coastal plain. And the other is some simulation modeling that I've done to address potential future scenarios of longleaf pine in a smaller ecoregion on the coastal plain. So my talk will be about understanding recent and potential threats to southern ecosystems using Landfire data and tools. So the first project I'm going to talk about is a project where we aimed to make the case that, or formally make the case that the North American coastal plain is a global biodiversity hotspot. And I've been working with a number of researchers across the Southeast. And so to be a global biodiversity hotspot, you not only have to be high in biodiversity, but a region also has to have a high degree of modification of the vegetation. So while the other folks that I was working with were tackling the biodiversity issue or part of that, I was working to assess the degree of modification across the region. And so my study area is almost all of this green and gray shaded region, but it doesn't include the portion in Mexico. So it goes from the Texas-Mexico border all the way up to basically to Cape Cod. And so we wanted to look at the degree of modification in the region and then also take it a step further and look at which habitats and which ecosystems might be most modified. So again, those are the questions looking at across the region and then particular habitats. And what I was using as far as Landfire data goes, what I used was the biophysical setting or BPS data, S-class, succession class data, and then state and transition models for each BPS. And I'll go through that now. But before I do that, I just wanted to kind of give some background, and some of you might know this. We have in the coastal plain in the Southeast among the globe's most endangered ecosystems, and there have been past estimates of vegetation modification in the region. Reed Noss has a fairly well-cited, well-known paper from 1995, well-known report, in which he stated that 98% of longleaf pine ecosystems have been lost. Cecil Frost has a number of papers, all kind of citing the number of about 97% of pine upland systems have been lost. And then other authors, Varner and Cush in 2004, have stated, again, a great deal of loss of vegetation. But most of these studies have either been just estimates, or they've used data for some ecosystems in some parts of the coastal plain, but not others. So we really wanted to look at a wall-to-wall assessment of all ecosystems in this work. And when we think about vegetation modification, we're certainly talking about conversion of vegetation. So this is a shot from Google Earth near Fayetteville, North Carolina. I think this is probably Fort Bragg. And obviously, it's easy to see things like urban or suburban development and the contrast between natural vegetation and those types of land uses. So data for the whole region on conversion to agriculture and conversion to urban land uses is certainly available. There are data sets like the National Land Cover data set from 2006 showing in reds the urban development and then yellows the agricultural areas. And so we can definitely get an estimate of those areas. But in the Southeast, we're also interested in knowing which places have been departed from their natural vegetation structure or fire regimes. And many of you who work in the Southeast are probably very familiar with the types of pictures the pictures that I'm showing here. On the left is a picture of longleaf pine savanna that has been frequently burned. So these, the vegetation has a fairly open understory and midstory and a fairly sparse canopy. But with changes to the fire regime and changes to other aspects of management, the two pictures on the right are the kinds of vegetation structure you might see instead. On the top, you might have denser canopy, more trees. On the bottom shows that you might have a thicker, denser understory or midstory resulting from changes to the fire regime, to fire suppression. So those are the types of departure, we're calling it, in vegetation that we also wanted to assess. So again, our idea of vegetation modification included both the conversion of vegetation, but then also this highly departed structure or highly departed fire regime. And it's often difficult to assess or map, especially the highly departed structure and fire regime across the region. There are some data sets like LIDAR that will allow it and will facilitate it. But then also, it's difficult to have a reference condition to compare the current structure to. And Landfire provides some nice tools for doing both of those things, for assessing the structure and fire regime, and also for reference conditions. And I'm just going to keep going. If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat box. I'll maybe stop after this first part for sure to answer some questions, but just a reminder to please type in any questions you have. Okay, so one of the Landfire data sets that's available that I used was the BPS data, the biophysical settings data, and this was a data set that was used to assess reference conditions. So these BPS data were developed by Landfire. They depict basically the distribution of vegetation types that would have occurred in pre-European settlement conditions. So these are developed by Landfire. There are 159 BPSs mapped in the coastal plain. And for each BPS that was mapped and that was considered by Landfire, there was also a state in transition model developed. And so here's an example of one longleaf pine BPS, one state in transition model for one longleaf pine ecosystem. And so this state in transition model shows, this picture shows that in this model, there are 5 succession classes, or S classes. Those are the boxes there. And there are arrows between those boxes, which are transitions due to succession or disturbance. And so in this model, a stand, let me see if I can get the pointer to work. Yes. A stand might start in early succession, and after 15 years, it transitions with frequent fire, it transitions to an open canopy state, mid-succession state class. And then after 75 years, it would transition to an open canopy late succession state class. So that's the succession pathway with frequent fire. Now with fire suppression, you get this alternate pathway, which has two boxes, two states that parallel the open canopy. These are closed canopy conditions. And then for all of these states, you have things like, you can have things like replacement fires that would reset succession. You can also have these looped arrows represent surface fires that might not change the character of a stand, but might keep it in the open state. And so Landfire developed one of these state classes for every BPS in the U.S., but in the coastal plain. And so when you run this, and Landfire did run this model, this simulation model, taking stands from early to mid to late succession, and you run it for many hundreds of years, you can get an idea of what the pre-European settlement distribution of these classes would have been across the landscape. So with a lot of fire, which we would have had in the coastal plain under pre-European settlement, you might get more of the open classes. All right, so that was another Landfire tool that was used for assessing reference conditions. Now to get an idea of the current conditions then in the landscape, I used Landfire S-class data. That's succession class data again, and here's a map of the portion of the Southeast. But Landfire again did this for the whole US, and the colors there right here correspond, the class A through E correspond to those 5 boxes. So they basically mapped the succession classes in each of the 5 boxes and mapped those on the current landscape. So this is the current landscape, and we can compare it to the pre-settlement landscape distribution of those classes for each BPS and for the whole region. And then you'll note that Landfire also is mapping agriculture and developed land or urban land. So we can also use this data to understand or to estimate or to calculate the area of each BPS that has been converted. So, but to look at the modification or the departure in vegetation structure, we get something like this. So I mentioned earlier that you can run that state and transition model over hundreds of years and get a distribution among those 5 state classes. So these light blue bars are the reference condition that Landfire got when it ran those state and transition models. So you see that a good portion of the landscape is in the mid-open and the late open states. The dark bars represent what we get when we overlay, when we look at the current S-class distribution. And this is just for longleaf pine again. This is just this example. We did the same thing for every BPS. But here we have, for longleaf, we have a buildup, kind of a large proportion in this mid-closed state. So we can compare the 2 distributions to assess the departure of the vegetation. And that's what I did. So comparing the proportions in each set of bars for each state class gives the percent departure, vegetation departure. And it's actually the difference between the current and historic, the sum of those differences. So the sum of these changes divided by 2. And the formula isn't so important here. It's just to note that we are comparing, this is the way we're comparing the current and historic conditions. But I also wanted to add in something about the fire regime. So if you recall that those 5 boxes are characterizing the canopy structure. So it's open canopy or closed canopy. But we also have the cases in which vegetation understory structure or composition have changed due to changes in the fire regime. And so I wanted to incorporate that. And the way I did it was I collected recent wildfire records across much of the coastal plain as much as I could get. And I compared the annual area burned recently due to in the recent wildfire records to the Landfire state and transition models, the annual area burned that would have that was modeled in the state and transition models in pre-settlement conditions. So that's the gist of what I did. The result was that recent area burned was only 15% of that that was estimated in pre-settlement. Or the converse of that is that the current fire regime is 85% departed from estimated pre-settlement conditions or fire regimes, fire frequencies. So what I did with that is that I assumed that that departure would definitely apply to high fire frequency ecosystems in the coastal plain. Now there are some systems that are estimated to, have, dozens or hundreds of years or more between fires, and I didn't want the recent wildfire data to characterize those ecosystems. So kind of conservatively only applied this departure to high fire frequency ecosystems. And so what we get is, or what we have from all this now, let's see, I see a question. Okay, yeah, Alan is asking about prescribed burning, and that, yeah, a couple of people now are asking about prescribed burning. So that's a good question, and I sought to get prescribed fire records. The way I was doing this was I haven't gone into this in this presentation, but it was in a spatially explicit way because I needed to know which ecosystems had experienced which types of which amounts of fire regime departure, and so I needed to get good, somewhat spatially explicit, at least to the county level data, and I didn't have that for prescribed fires across a majority of counties. I had estimates for the whole region, and I had estimates, or I had some data for some federal lands, but I could not get enough data on prescribed burns as I needed. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. Certainly some places would have would experience a lot more fire. On the other hand, the wildfire data is kind of my estimate that using that to characterize fire regime departure might be a little bit on the, that might show a little bit more fire in the landscape, wildfire in the landscape than there actually is in terms of wildfire in natural areas. So because a lot of the wildfires actually might be in agricultural areas or done for agriculture. So while the wildfire data might be kind of an overestimate, not including prescribed burn areas might be an underestimate. So on the whole, it's my hope that that kind of evens out, but that is a shortcoming for sure. And if I were to do this on a smaller area, for sure I'd want to use prescribed burn data. Let me know if that answers your question or if you have further thoughts on that. I'd be happy to talk more. I did talk with a bunch of folks about getting some data in it on prescribed fire, and it didn't end up working out for what I needed. So, all right, let's move on, but please feel free to follow up on that. Okay, so putting this all together, I have data on, or I have assessed now vegetation departure, fire regime departure, and then, like I mentioned, I could get an amount for conversion, the proportion converted to urban and agriculture. So what I did is I averaged for each BPS, I averaged the vegetation departure and the fire regime departure scores, and I took the proportion of each BPS where that average was over 66%, so on the high end of the departure. So those were the highly departed portions of each BPS. And then I added to that the conversion proportion. And the result is the total modification then. And again, I did that for each BPS. I also summarized it by broad habitat type and the entire region as a whole. And so here are the results, some of the results. The first bar on the left shows the coastal plain result, and the numbers at the top are the total modification, and the colors represent the highly departed and converted proportions. So for the coastal plain, you see 85% modified. And then the three bars on the right break that down into three broad habitat types, so forests, grasslands, and savannas or woodlands. You notice that the total modification for forests is lower, while the other two broad habitats have higher rates of modification. And so these numbers do correspond well, especially for the grasslands and savannas, do correspond well with those previous estimates. So that was nice to see. And that 85% for the whole coastal plain was good news for our original objective for this project, which is a global biodiversity hotspot. The sort of criterion is to have 70% or more modification to the vegetation, to the natural vegetation. So that was good news for that. But it's interesting also to look at the differences among habitat types in terms of their conversion versus their departure. So while for the whole coastal plain you kind of get half and half converted and departed, for the other habitats you get slight differences, and especially in the savannas, we have actually a fairly low proportion converted to urban or agriculture, and then a much higher proportion which is highly departed. We can also break that down. Like I said, I did this for each BPS, so we can look at that. Here's just a few examples. The top few show BPSs that correspond to longleaf savannas or woodlands. And I think there are 6 there. And we can look at first the last column, which is total modification. You'll notice that all of those have close to 100% of their area being modified, which is interesting. And then there is quite a bit of difference between the proportions highly departed and converted for different BPSs. Some have fairly low conversion rates, but have much higher departure rates, which is interesting and is, in my mind, this type of analysis could be a starting point for prioritizing ecosystems or prioritizing management among ecosystems. If we look then quickly at the forests, we get a wider range of modifications. Some have fairly low modification and some have quite high modification. But again, this could be a starting point for priorities. Maybe a BPS with lower conversion but higher departure has a lot more opportunity for things like management for restoration, because a lot of the area hasn't been completely converted, it's just departed, that kind of thing. So this kind of assessment is really useful for that. And I'll wrap up here just with some summary comments. And just to say that this Landfire data allowed a quantitative assessment, really the first one across the whole coastal plain, based on some data that's wall-to-wall for the whole region, which is really nice. And again, the coastal plain was 85% modified. Some systems are 96% to 100% modified in those woodlands and grassland systems. And the results, it was nice to see the results generally matching the older estimates. And again, the work can be kind of a starting point for prioritizing which systems to focus on and which types of management or actions could be taken for those systems. And again, this could be repeated with the same data for other systems across other regions or smaller regions, and you'd get slightly different results. But I'm happy to pause now to take a few questions if there are some. Otherwise, I'll keep moving along to the second example. All right. I'll move on, but please feel free to ask questions. So the second example focuses on a smaller ecoregion within the coastal plain. This is the Doherty Plain ecoregion. This is the coastal plain of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And this map shows the distribution of agriculture and longleaf and planted pine in urban areas. And we're interested in looking at the future of longleaf under a few scenarios in this ecoregion. And so we saw this before. This is the distribution of those 5 state classes in pre-settlement conditions and then currently. And the question again then is what might be the future distribution of these state classes across longleaf in the region. And there have been some recent studies, some recent reports that have thought about the future conservation in longleaf and set some goals and given some recommendations. So this, some of the results that I'll be showing will be put in the context of this one particular report, which many of you might be familiar with. This is from 2009, America's Longleaf Range-Wide Conservation Plan for Longleaf Pine. And they had 2 goals. One was to increase the total area of longleaf by 135% across the Southeast, and one was to double the area of open longleaf in the Southeast. And that report gave 2 broad recommendations in terms of management focus. One was to focus first on maintaining open stands, and then the second was to then move to improving and restoring degraded stands. So that's the context in which we were working in this study and in which I'll sort of present the results of the study. So again, we were interested in, over the next century, will conservation goals for longleaf be met under scenarios of climate change, urbanization, and potential management. And in this study, the biggest part of the work was done to modify Landfire state and transition models to reflect future scenarios. So if you recall that those state and transition models aim to characterize pre-settlement conditions and fire probabilities. In this study, I modified those to fit the goal. And so again, here's that 5-box state and transition model again. And you recall that there are transitions that represent fires, and those are given probabilities. Surface fires are the looped arrows and replacement fires. And in the pre-settlement version of the model, in the Landfire version of the model, surface fires were, for example, given a probability of, I think it was 33%. So every 3 years there would be a surface fire under this model of pre-settlement. The first thing I did to modify the model was to use the same recent wildfire records that I talked about earlier and adjust the probabilities of wildfire. And so the result of that, when I calibrated the model to produce the same area burned each year as the wildfire records show, the result was that surface fires actually occurred with a probability of 0.02. So 2/100ths was so 1 every 50 years instead of 1 every 3 years. And replacement fires were lower than that. So that was the first modification. The second was to incorporate the effect of climate change on wildfires. And the way I did that, I worked with a colleague here to develop a statistical model, statistical relationship to basically predict the recent area burned as a function of climate data. So we used the recent burn records and correlated those with climate variables recent climate variables, and then we use that same relationship to project into the future about how much annual area would be burned according to 2 climate scenarios. And if you look at the graph here, just pay attention to this middle line. The other 2 lines are there to show the range because we averaged across climate models, but that's not important here. The middle line basically shows the change in wildfire probability over time due to climate change. So we use this as a multiplier on the probability in the state and transition model, but basically a change of 1 is no change. There was if you multiply a probability by 1, you get no change, and you can see that that is very close to 1 throughout the century. It increases a little bit, but this basically shows that those low probabilities of fire, even in the future, under our model, would not change much. And this is for the A1FI, the high emissions climate scenario, but the other one we used, the B1, was similar. The third type of modification we did was to add in potential for urbanization, and we have in our lab here a model, a projection of urbanization across the Southeast. So I used that projection in the Doherty Plain ecoregion to get an annual probability of any state class in the longleaf pine model being urbanized. So essentially any of the boxes could be converted to urban. Oh, and I see this this question from Nathan, and I don't know how long it's been there, but so I apologize. But he's asking, has there been any talk about changing non-burnable ag into a seasonally burnable fuel type? And that, if that's a question for my project specifically, I'm mostly not considering the difference between burnable and non-burnable ag. I'm considering it all to be different from longleaf pine or different from these natural types, and so that's completely converted. I understand that some ag is burnable and could, and in terms of the fire regime, could be closer to, have closer to the characteristics of some of the natural vegetation in terms of their fire than other types of ag, and that. But I didn't incorporate that. If you have a question about the landfire data as a whole, like the data set as a whole, and how that's being characterized, you might have to ask some of the landfire folks about that. I'm not sure. All right, so after adding the urban transitions, I also added 3 types of management transitions to the state and transition model. So these reflect different types of longleaf pine management. One was a maintenance, so maintenance burning, basically to keep open canopy open and early succession stands in their current state and prevent them from becoming closed stands. So that's that focus on maintaining open longleaf stands. Second type of management I added was improvement, and so that would be a series of burns and thinning and other management that would transition a closed canopy stand to open canopy. And then the third type was restoration, and that would transition planted pine and agriculture to an early succession longleaf pine. So again, that's a number of management steps that transition represents, including cutting and a series of burns and site prep, etc. So those 3 types of transitions were added, and I characterized them and their probabilities and failure and success rates according to the literature and recent reports and recent data on best practices with those. So those were added. And then once we had the model modified and added the changes due to climate change and urbanization and management, then we came up with some scenarios to run for the future. So we have a series of 14 scenarios, 7 with urbanization and 7 without. So this list shows the ones without urbanization, and we have a parallel 7 with urbanization. So the first 3 here are scenarios without management. They're different climate change scenarios, no climate, high emissions, and low emissions. And then the last ones here include management. Half of those scenarios include maintenance only, so burning those open stands to maintain their open character. And then the other half of the management scenarios include a portfolio, what I'm calling a portfolio of management. That's the 3 different types of management: maintenance, improvement, and restoration. And then for each of those pairs of scenarios, we have a level that approximates recent burning in the region, just areas of burning, areas that have been burned, unprescribed burning, or managed, or areas that have been managed with a different portfolio of management. And then a second scenario that doubles that area. So it's current levels and then double current levels for each. So those are the scenarios, combination of climate, urbanization, and management. And when we start with that original landscape, the current landscape that I showed on the first slide for the Doherty Plain, and we run that over time, we simulate change over time, dynamics over time in these scenarios. These are the kinds of results we get. And I know this is a lot of graphs, but I'll walk you through this. Hopefully it'll be fairly easy to interpret. So here in each box is a scenario, and in each box the total height of all of the colors represents the total area of longleaf in the Doherty Plain ecoregion. Now the colors correspond to one of the 5 boxes in the model. So the blues are early succession or the open states. The reds are the closed states. So you can see how those states change over time and get an idea of what portion of the landscape is covered in different state classes. So the first thing you'll see is that the scenarios, the first 6 scenarios, so this top line here and then these 2, really show a decrease and hardly any of the open states over time. By the end of the simulation period, it's almost all closed, including management. So the rest of the scenarios actually results in an increase over time, no matter what the scenario is in the open state classes. So that's one interesting thing, result. You'll also notice that the only scenarios that result in an increase in total longleaf area, so sort of a increasing top line here, are the ones that include a portfolio of management, so these last 4. So those are some of the results, some of the ways to look at this. Another way to look at these results is this summary chart here. And in this chart, each dot or triangle corresponds to a scenario. And in this case, the colors represent levels of management, and actually all of the scenarios without management kind of overlap each other. So they're all down here. The blues are with management, and the types of management are parallel to the colors. So this light corresponds with a maintenance only scenario. This kind of medium blue is a portfolio, and then the top 2 are the maintenance only times 2, so doubling management but focusing on maintenance burning only, and then using a portfolio of management and doubling that. Now the axes here are the change in total longleaf area on the x-axis, And so dots that are farther to the right here have more longleaf, more total longleaf than they started with. And then the y-axis is increase in area of open longleaf, and dots to the sort of toward the top have more open longleaf than they started with. Now you'll also see there's this red line here representing the one conservation goal from the range-wide assessment report, range-wide conservation report, of doubling the area of open longleaf in the future. So that was one of the goals. The other goal was to increase the total area of longleaf by 135%, and that actually didn't make it on this graph because it would be way out here, and no scenarios came close to that. But a few scenarios did meet the goal of doubling open longleaf, and those were the ones that both of the management portfolio ×2 scenarios, so doubling management and including a portfolio, did more than double, way more than double open longleaf. Even with urbanization, the triangles, sorry I forgot to say, the triangles for each set of scenarios are with urbanization. So even with urbanization, we still get quite an increase in open longleaf under that scenario. And we do get an increase in total area of longleaf, some increase in that scenario too. So this is a way to kind of look at some trade-offs. We did this for one ecoregion under these scenarios through 100 years. And you can certainly get a sense of if you wanted to put your resources and focus on maintenance only, where would you end up? If you were able to double your management over time, where would you end up if you put it into maintenance only versus management portfolio, et cetera? But again, this shows that any scenario with management did better, at least in terms of the area of open longleaf, than no management in this case. Okay, so just one last summary slide. Again, we used Landfire state and transition model, and we modified it to reflect current and future dynamics in the longleaf pine ecosystem. Under these scenarios, any of the management scenarios we looked at had a better outcome than no management. And doubling the area managed and including a portfolio of management was the best overall in terms of increasing open longleaf and total longleaf area, but no scenario reached both of those conservation goals for increasing longleaf. Now, of course, so this is one tool which I think is really, the state and transition models can be a really great tool for looking at these kinds of trade-offs, but you should, you might want to also include costs and available resources, depending on what your goal is, especially if this is, guiding management at a local level. You also might want to consider, say, a shorter time frame. We did 100 years, but obviously most of you all know probably better than I do that, management plans don't often operate on 100-year timescales, at least in terms of getting funding and that kind of thing. So, a smaller time window would be great to consider as well. Yeah, in general, this is a really flexible method to look at, different trade-offs and different management techniques and strategies and what those outcomes might be in the future. So with that, I think that's it. I'll just recognize some collaborators, and especially the TNC LANDFIRE team has been really helpful in getting data and interpreting Landfire data, and helping me, work through using some of it. But so they've been really great. I have to acknowledge them, and I'm happy to answer some questions about using Landfire or the methods specific to my study. So thanks a lot.